Imagine this, a steel giant lurking in the deep, a real symbol of national power, just gliding silently through these icy, unforgiving waters. It's got 118 men aboard. This isn't just any submarine. We're talking about the K-141 Kursk, a nuclear sub so formidable, so tough, they actually called it unsinkable. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, an internal catastrophe. A series of blasts just tear right through its core, sending it plunging down to the seabed. It's a truly chilling story, the tragedy of the Kursk, a disaster that didn't just wound Russia, it sent shockwaves clear across the globe. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack the incredible and, tragic story of the Kursk. We'll get into its cutting-edge design, the really intense geopolitical backdrop of its final mission, the complex chain of events that led to its sinking, and then that desperate, ultimately futile struggle for survival and rescue that followed. You'll discover some surprising facts, the intense human drama, and the critical lessons learned from, one of the greatest naval tragedies of our time.
Think of it as a shortcut to being really well informed on a pivotal but often misunderstood piece of history. Okay, so when we talk about the Kursk, it's just monumental. You mentioned it was a war weapon built for radical dissuasion. Now, what was the thinking behind that? That strategic philosophy. How did it actually shape the sub's design?
Well, the intent behind it is fascinating. The Kursk, officially an Oscar to second-class Project 949A ante for the Russians, was a nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine. It was part of this top-secret series built specifically, explicitly, to counter NATO naval power. This was during the tail end of the Cold War and heading into the post-Soviet years. Its sheer existence was meant as a deterrent, a really formidable threat that could, shift the balance of naval power just by being there. It was literally designed as this metal giant meant to ensure a balance against Western fleets. It was a statement of enduring strength, even as the Soviet Union was fading.
And giant barely covers it, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to picture the scale. This thing was a colossus of the deep, wasn't it? Tell us about its physical size, because it sounds almost unreal.
It's almost mind-boggling, yeah. The Kursk measured a staggering 154 meters long. That's about 505 feet. Just try to visualize it. Roughly the length of two jumbo jets parked nose to tail, and it was 18.2 meters, or 60 feet wide. Displaced over 24,000 tons submerged. Imagine a 6-story building, but just gliding silently under the waves. And its construction was incredibly robust. It featured this unique double-skinned hull, the outer hull, made of 8.5 millimeters of high nickel, high chromium stainless steel. Super strong stuff. Then it was covered in a 3-inch thick layer of rubber. That was for stealth, to absorb sonar signals and also for corrosion resistance. This double hull, it had like a 6.5-foot gap between the inner and outer layers, was specifically designed to take a direct torpedo hit or survive a collision. Add to that its 10 watertight compartments, each meant to be sealed off in an emergency. And you really start to see why it got that almost mythical, unsinkable reputation. Though that very confidence, that perceived invulnerability, might have, inadvertently masked some deeper systemic vulnerabilities, kind of setting the stage for what happened later.
That's just astounding. Really highlights why they thought it was unsinkable. But okay, engineering aside, what about its teeth? What kind of punch did this underwater behemoth pack?
Oh, its power was incredible. Propulsion first. It ran on 2 OK-650 nuclear reactors. These churned out a massive 97,990 horsepower. That let it hit speeds up to 33 knots when fully submerged, which is incredibly fast for something that huge. But its real offensive power, that was in its armament. It carried 24 P-700 Granite cruise missiles. NATO had a chilling name for them, the SSN-19 Shipwreck. And you can see why. Imagine a missile the size of a small bus weighing over 15,000 pounds, hurtling through the air at Mach 1.6, faster than most fighter jets. These weren't just impressive, they were designed to be utterly devastating range, 388 miles. And they could be armed with conventional high-explosive warheads or, far more terrifyingly, 500 kiloton nuclear warheads, each one capable, supposedly, of turning any American ship into dust or sinking an entire aircraft carrier.
Wow, Shipwreck is right. Scary stuff. But it wasn't just those massive cruise missiles, was it? It had a pretty formidable torpedo arsenal, too.
Exactly. Besides the Granites, it carried 28 torpedoes or anti-submarine missiles. Among them was the Type 65 Kit torpedo. The sailors had nicknames for it, Fat Girl or Whale. And this torpedo was particularly potent. It had a 990-pound warhead that, even on its own, was powerful enough to sink an aircraft carrier. It was a true deep-sea predator, really equipped to handle just about any naval threat out there.
Okay, so immense power, long deployments underwater. Submarine life is notoriously tough. What was it actually like for the crew aboard this specific machine? Our sources suggest it was, relatively good for a sub, which maybe isn't saying a whole lot.
Yeah, For a submarine, relatively speaking, they did try to mitigate the harsh conditions. The sheer size of the Kursk allowed for conditions that were, quite spacious compared to other subs, which are notoriously cramped. Senior officers, for instance, had their own staterooms, not just bunks in common areas. And there was even a small gymnasium on board, which is pretty unusual. It didn't have the luxuries of a sauna or solarium like the even bigger Typhoon-class subs, but these amenities were definitely designed to make those long deployments more bearable. It was an attempt to keep morale up, maintain efficiency. Even though, paradoxically, the broader economic reality back then meant these sailors were often paid very little, sometimes not at all. A really stark contrast to the incredibly advanced technology they were operating. Hashtag B, symbol of Russian power.
So it was this unparalleled feat of engineering, a true force of nature underwater. But beyond just the hardware, the Kursk quickly became more than just a military asset. It turned into this powerful symbol for a Russia really grappling with its identity in the post-Cold War world. How did this beast of the deep end up representing national pride?
Oh, absolutely. The Kursk, launched in 1994, became this potent symbol of Russia's enduring naval strength, and its ambition, really, to reassert itself on the global stage after the Soviet Union dissolved in '91. You have to remember, the nation was dealing with severe economic hardship, a diminished international standing, a perceived decline in influence. The Kursk offered this tangible display of continued might. It was reassurance for its own people and a challenge to the West. A prime example. That 1999 deployment to the Mediterranean, it successfully tracked the USS Theodore Roosevelt, a major American aircraft carrier. That operation reportedly cost NATO tens of millions of dollars just trying to locate it, and it sent a clear, almost defiant message. There's that quote attributed to a Russian admiral at the time, "We're still here, losers." It was a critical assertion of relevance, basically saying Russia, even though wounded, was far from out of the game.
And it even carried a name with huge historical significance, right? That must have added to its symbolic importance.
Yes, exactly. The submarine was named after the Battle of Kursk, a pivotal event in 1943. This was the largest tank battle of World War II, a absolutely crushing Soviet victory that held deep national pride. It resonated profoundly with the Russian people's sense of resilience and military prowess. So, naming such a formidable modern submarine after that battle further cemented its symbolic importance and national identity. It connected this new power to a glorious past.
Right, so an impressive vessel, a huge source of national pride, designed for power and deterrence. Yet, the story of the Kursk accident didn't really start in 2000, did it? Or even in those icy waters. Our deep dive suggests its roots go back much, much further. To a decade of decline, really. Hashtag context to decline and ambition.
This is where it gets really interesting and quite tragic, because the true beginning of the Kursk disaster, looking back, you can trace it back a whole decade earlier, back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. That revolution brought freedoms, sure, but it also exposed a nation teetering on the brink of economic collapse. And the Navy, especially its once mighty submarine force, really bore the brunt of these severe economic hardships. At its peak, say mid-1980s, the Soviet subforce had maybe 180 operational boats. By the late 90s, that number had plummeted. Fewer than 40 operational vessels. You had northern ports literally filled with rusting, abandoned submarines. It was a stark visual of the decline. Sailors endured unpaid wages, sometimes for months, harsh conditions in garrison towns like Vidyayevo, where the Kursk crew was based. Just trying to maintain these high-tech, complex systems with almost no financial backup, no support, it became incredibly difficult. And, as we'll see, inherently dangerous. Corners were cut. Critical maintenance got neglected.
So a decade of decline and neglect sets the stage. But then, in August 2000, Russia decides it's time for this dramatic show of strength, an exercise called Summer X. What were the pressures on President Putin and the military that made this exercise so critical at that moment?
Oh, it was absolutely critical. A really high-stakes gamble, you could say. Summer X was Russia's first large-scale naval exercise in over a decade. It involved over 30 vessels, including 6 submarines, thousands of sailors. It was massive. At the time, the nation was grappling with the ongoing Chechen civil war, costly, unpopular. And they felt increasingly dismissed by NATO, which was expanding eastward. So this exercise was meticulously designed to restore domestic confidence in the Federation's power, project an image of renewed strength, and send a clear message internationally. Russia is still a force to be reckoned with. It also happened to coincide, maybe not coincidentally, with President Putin's 100th day in office. That just added another layer of political significance to its success. The pressure to perform was just immense, almost overwhelming.
And this wasn't just any old exercise, was it? It was close to Norway, NATO forces were watching like hawks, and there was this hidden, top-secret agenda involved. What kind of risks did that level of secrecy bring?
That's right. Its location near the Norwegian coast meant constant scrutiny. NATO forces, including American subs like the USS Memphis and the British HMS Splendid, were definitely listening in. They had advanced capabilities. But what wasn't widely known, and stayed top secret for years, was a mission embedded within Summer X. They were testing the ability to sneak a nuclear missile submarine, like the Kursk, past American spy subs, to operate undetected under the Arctic ice. This was a direct challenge to the Western early warning system, kind of a throwback to Cold War espionage tactics. The secrecy was paramount, driven by this deep-seated distrust of Western powers. But it also meant that if something went wrong, the outside world, even parts of Russia's own command structure, would be kept completely in the dark, which of course could only exacerbate any potential disaster. The stakes were incredibly high. It really felt like an echo of the Cold War itself. Hashtag be narrative be.
Okay, so against this backdrop ambition, decline, high-stakes secrecy, we get to the actual tools being used in the exercise. And this is where a critical and ultimately deadly vulnerability comes into play. The torpedoes. Specifically, that Type 65 kit, the one the sailors called the Fat Girl. What made this particular weapon so dangerous?
The Type 65 kit torpedo, yeah, the Fat Girl or Whale.
Yeah.
It was central to the Kursk's planned mock attack during the exercise. It was a huge weapon, 35 feet long, weighed almost 5 tons even without a warhead. But the crucial element, the really dangerous part, was its propellant. High Test Peroxide, or HTP. This is basically an extremely concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, way more potent than the stuff you have in your bathroom cabinet. It gets combined with kerosene fuel to propel the torpedo, makes it incredibly powerful, sure, but also incredibly unstable.
So HTP, I understand it's a bit of a gamble. You called it a temperamental but powerful chemical.
Yeah.
What makes it so inherently risky beyond just being strong?
It is indeed temperamental, almost like a chemical time bomb, really. HTP's big danger is its extreme reactivity. If it comes into contact with certain catalytic materials, things like copper, brass, even just dust or oil, it rapidly decomposes. This chemical reaction generates immense heat, we're talking thousands of degrees Celsius, and it causes the volume of the peroxide to expand by an astonishing 5,000 times, almost instantly. This rapid expansion creates this massive explosive pressure buildup. And what's really critical here, and frankly alarming, is that both the British and American navies had actually introduced peroxide torpedoes around the end of World War II, but they had abandoned HTP torpedoes entirely by the 1960s because they were just too dangerous. There had been accidents, yet Russia continued using them, largely because of economic constraints, a lack of good alternatives, and maybe a stubborn reliance on older technologies. They were essentially gambling on a known hazard that other major naval powers had already decided was just too risky.
So Russia's using this incredibly volatile stuff that other navies had ditched. And in the context of that cash-strapped Russian Navy in 2000, it sounds like these HTP torpedoes were, as our sources put it, basically accidents waiting to happen. A direct consequence of that broader economic decline we talked about. What was the chain of failures leading up to the disaster?
That's a grim way to put it, but yeah, pretty accurate. HTP torpedoes needed rigorous, highly skilled, ongoing maintenance to stay stable and safe. But in the post-Soviet Russian Navy, that critical upkeep was often neglected. It fell victim to those deep budget cuts. Records that came out later indicated that the specific dummy torpedo loaded onto the Kursk just hadn't received the required maintenance. It was 10 years old, components were well past their service life, there were even reports it might have been damaged during transport, and disturbingly, crew members had apparently observed fuel leaking from its rubber seals the day before the exercise. But despite these explicit warnings from the crew, the torpedo was loaded anyway. A catastrophic failure in protocol, really driven by the imperative to complete the mission, to make the exercise look good, ignoring these glaring safety red flags.
And if that wasn't bad enough, compounding the danger, the crew itself wasn't even really familiar with operating this specific weapon. What are the implications of that? Insufficient training when you're handling something so volatile.
Precisely. The Kursk crew had actually never worked with this specific type of HTP torpedo before the summer of 2000. Their training for it was reportedly, well, spontaneous and insufficient, just cobbled together without the depth of repetition you absolutely need for such a hazardous system. So picture it. You've got a highly volatile, poorly maintained torpedo being loaded and prepared by an inexperienced crew under immense pressure to perform in this high-stakes exercise for national pride. That combination just created a truly catastrophic recipe for disaster. Human error, systemic neglect, and the inherent dangers of the technology all tangled together.
So all the ingredients for a tragedy were there, just waiting for a spark. And on August 12, 2000, that recipe ignited in the Barents Sea. Just after 11:28 in the morning, #go. The first explosion?
Yeah, that critical moment, the high test peroxide, which had been leaking from that faulty Type 65 torpedo, it finally made contact with a catalyst. Probably brass or copper from the torpedo casing, maybe some residual oil or dust inside the torpedo tube. This caused pressure to build with irresistible force, as the official report later put it. The rapidly expanding HTP then broke right through the torpedo's kerosene fuel tank, instantly igniting it. This wasn't just a leak anymore, it was a violent chemical reaction. Basically, an internal explosion within the torpedo itself.
Yeah.
A chemical time bomb just went off.
And the result was this catastrophic blast right there in the torpedo room, compartment 1. How powerful are we talking for this initial explosion? And what was the immediate human cost?
The initial explosion was equivalent to somewhere between 200 and 550 pounds of TNT, powerful enough that it registered 1.5 on the Richter scale. Seismic sensors over 65 miles away picked it up. This blast just erupted violently backward into compartment 1, the torpedo room. A massive fireball burning at an absolutely astonishing 2,700 degrees Celsius, that's nearly 5,000 Fahrenheit, instantly incinerated and killed all 7 crew members in that section. There was just no chance of survival for anyone right there. The heat, the pressure, immense, capable of cooking everything in its path.
That's horrifying. And what's truly shocking is that the devastation wasn't contained, was it? There were critical design flaws that let the blast, the fire, the toxic smoke just spread rapidly. This seems to defy the whole point of watertight compartments.
Unfortunately, yes. A critical design vulnerability was just shockingly exposed in that moment. The valve that traversed the bulkhead between compartment 1 and compartment 2, where the control room was, had been left open. Now, this was apparently a standard, though definitely risky, operational procedure. They did it to manage pressure during torpedo launch sequences. But worse than that, there was a 40-centimeter, about a 16-inch ventilation duct made of thin alloy. And this duct connected the first 4 compartments. It basically created a superhighway for destruction. It allowed that initial blast, the superheated fire, the toxic smoke to just spread rapidly, uncontained, as far back as the 4th compartment. It completely compromised the sub's ability to compartmentalize damage, which, as you say, was supposed to be its ultimate safeguard.
And the immediate devastating consequence of that uncontrolled spread was that nobody could even send a distress signal or activate basic emergency procedures, like blowing the ballast tanks to surface. This was the command center, right?
Exactly. The control room, compartment 2, was hit almost instantly. The commander, Captain Gennady Lyachin, and 36 other men in that area were either killed instantly by the blast, the fire, the toxic gases, or they were incapacitated beyond any ability to act. That explains why no distress signal was ever sent from the submarine. And crucially, why the emergency ballast tank below the system designed to rapidly surface the sub in an emergency was never activated. Compounding all this, there was an emergency rescue buoy located way back in compartment 7. It was designed to automatically deploy in this kind of event and transmit a distress signal, but it had been deliberately disabled during a mission back in 1999, apparently to avoid detection by U.S. ships, and it had never been reactivated. Just a perfect storm of operational oversights and systemic failures sealing the sub's fate in those critical first minutes. #B, the second devastating explosion.
As if that wasn't horrific enough, just a couple of minutes after that first blast, the Kursk was rocked by a second, far more powerful explosion. This one sounded like a monster blast, didn't it? Detected literally across the globe.
It was absolutely a monster. And yeah, a truly global event in terms of its detection. Just 2 minutes and 15 seconds after the first explosion, so around 11:31 a.m., this second immensely powerful explosion ripped through the submarine. This blast was estimated to be anywhere from 40 to 250 times greater than the initial one. It registered a massive 4.2 on the Richter scale. To put that in perspective, that's like the force of 3 to 7 tons of TNT going off underwater. The immense shock wave it generated was detected by seismic stations all over the globe, from Alaska to Europe, a chilling indicator of its devastating scale and power.
And this second explosion wasn't just a chemical reaction like the first one,
Yeah.
right? This was the detonation of live warheads. That's a terrifying chain reaction.
That's the horrifying reality. The fire spreading from the first explosion, the extreme heat. It quickly reached the other torpedoes stored in the forward section. This resulted in the catastrophic detonation of at least 4, possibly up to 7, live torpedo warheads. It created an even more destructive event than the first, just a successive compounding disaster, each stage more terrible than the last.
The damage from this second blast must have been absolutely devastating, obliterating a huge part of the submarine. Can you paint a picture of what happened to the front of the Kursk then?
It was utterly catastrophic. This second blast basically obliterated the front of the Kursk. It ripped a massive 22-foot hole in the hull. The sheer force just tore that robust double-hulled structure apart like paper. The first four compartments were completely exposed to the crushing pressure of the ocean. Water flooded in at an estimated 90,000 liters per second. Just unimaginable speed and volume. Anyone who might, by some miracle, still have been alive in those sections after the initial explosion would have been instantly crushed under the immense pressure of the incoming water. It would have filled those compartments in mere seconds. The entire bow, from the sail downwards, was just a shredded, twisted mess, essentially a pile of metal on the seabed.
Amidst all this chaos and destruction, there was one critical safety system that actually worked as designed, preventing an even worse catastrophe. You mentioned the nuclear reactors. What was it about their design that allowed them to withstand such an impact?
Thankfully, yes. A small mercy in a sea of tragedy. The heavily reinforced nuclear reactors, located back in Compartment 5, were designed specifically to withstand these kinds of impacts and operate autonomously. They automatically shut down exactly as intended. Their containment vessels were incredibly robust, built to resist extreme forces. This crucial safety mechanism prevented what could have been an even greater nuclear disaster, a potentially uncontrolled meltdown, that would have had just devastating environmental consequences for the Barents Sea and everything around it. It was really a testament to the robust engineering in that particular, highly critical section of the submarine.
Okay, so despite these two enormous, devastating explosions tearing through the front of the Kursk, incredibly, unbelievably, some men actually survived. The great ship, mortally wounded, began its agonizing descent into the darkness.
Yeah, the submarine, its bow effectively ripped open, just slowly sank, stern first, tilting downwards. It came to rest about 350 to 354 feet down. That's 108 meters below the surface of the Barents Sea. The force of its impact with the seabed was so immense that it plowed about 72 feet deep into the ocean floor, burying its nose in the clay and mud. Just a dramatic, violent end for a vessel that was designed and believed to be unsinkable.
And against all odds, 23 men who were initially in compartments 6, 7, and 8 managed to make their way back and take refuge in the unflooded compartment 9, right at the stern. And among them, Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, head of the turbine unit, heroically stepped up as their de facto commander. It's truly a remarkable testament to human resilience in just unimaginable circumstances. So we had these 23 survivors huddled together in the pitch black, freezing cold, slowly flooding compartment 9. This shifts the story, doesn't it? It's not just about engineering failure anymore. It's this profound human drama, this desperate fight for survival, and they immediately faced an agonizing life or death decision. Hashtag, A. The decision to wait.
The dilemma they faced was truly agonizing. A choice between two equally terrifying options. They had these basic individual rescue hoods. They were designed to provide enough air for about a 100-meter swim to the surface. And at that early stage, just after the explosions, the pressure inside Compartment 9 was still close to normal sea level pressure. So that minimized the immediate risk of decompression sickness, the bends, that painful, potentially fatal condition from resurfacing too quickly. However, just opening the escape hatch itself presented immediate severe dangers. The compartment could be instantly flooded, drowning them all right there. And even if they did make it out, the water in the Barents Sea was frigid, near freezing. It offered maybe an hour of survival time on the surface before hypothermia set in. And finding them, 23 men bobbing in the vastness of the ocean, especially with the likely poor weather conditions, it would have been, as one expert put it, like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
Right. So given those absolutely perilous choices, they made a courageous decision, didn't they? To stay put, to wait for rescue. They must have believed the Northern Fleet would come for them. Confident in the fleet's submarine rescue capabilities, it speaks volumes about their training, their hope. And what's truly heartbreaking is that we have direct, tangible evidence of their resolve from that time.
Yes. What's incredibly haunting is the existence of notes written by Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov. His first note, apparently scrawled by the dim light of an emergency lamp, was written at 1:15 p.m., 13:15, less than 2 hours after that second massive blast. It offers this direct, poignant glimpse into their initial assessment and their resolve. It reads, "It's 13:15. All personnel from Section 6, 7, and 8 have moved to Section 9. 23 people are here. We feel bad, weakened by carbon dioxide. Pressure is increasing in the compartment. If we head for the surface, we won't survive the compression. We won't last more than a day. We have made this decision because none of us can escape." It's just a heroic, yet profoundly heartbreaking testament to their initial moments. Shows their clear understanding of how dire the situation was and their collective decision to wait. Hashtag B, the final hours.
You can almost feel the air thickening in that compartment, the hope slowly fading as time just stretched on and on. Without power, The conditions inside must have deteriorated rapidly. The cold, the dark, and that suffocating air. It's almost unthinkable.
Indeed. With the nuclear reactors shut down, there was zero power for heating, or, critically, for the air purification systems. The temperature inside the compartment just plummeted, dropping down towards freezing, exacerbating their already desperate situation. And without proper ventilation, the carbon dioxide levels steadily rose. Breathing became increasingly difficult and eventually deadly. The oxygen level was going down, the CO2 level was going up. Both would kill a person, slowly, agonizingly, if left unchecked.
They did have emergency air purifying systems, though, right? These little brick-sized potassium superoxide cartridges. They were ingenious devices meant to keep them alive. But as we'll tragically discover, they also carried this incredibly dangerous secret.
Yes, these cartridges were designed to absorb carbon dioxide and simultaneously release fresh oxygen through a chemical reaction. A vital piece of survival gear in that kind of emergency. The men would apparently pass them around, taking turns breathing from them in the deepening gloom. However, potassium superoxide, while brilliant for its intended purpose, is an extremely reactive and dangerous chemical if it's misused or comes into contact with the wrong thing.
And this is where the story takes yet another awful, tragic turn. A truly deadly accident involving these very life-saving but volatile cartridges. What was the specific mechanism? What happened with this chemical reaction that caused the final catastrophe for these men?
Unfortunately, yes. If potassium superoxide comes into contact with water, and especially oily water, which was slowly seeping into the compartment from the damaged hull and maybe lubricating systems, it reacts violently. This reaction releases immense heat, creating what's called a flash fire. It just rapidly consumes all the available oxygen in the immediate vicinity. It was like another chemical time bomb ticking away in the dark, just needing a small trigger.
So picture this horrific scenario. It's pitch black, freezing. The compartment is slowly flooding. Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov and two other men were trying to recharge one of these rebreather systems, trying to extend their precious few hours. And one cartridge was accidentally dropped into the oily water on the deck.
That's the reconstruction, yes. This immediately triggered an uncontrolled chemical explosion in that flash fire. The potassium hydroxide created by the reaction also caused severe corrosive chemical burns. Kolesnikov, for instance, suffered horrific injuries based on the later forensic examination. His abdomen was exposed, the skin from his head and neck was completely stripped away. It would have been an incredibly brutal, instantaneous event in that confined space, a desperate attempt at survival turning into a final, agonizing end. The irony is just truly heartbreaking. The very tools designed to sustain their lives ultimately consumed them.
The ultimate tragic end for the survivors, struck down by the very systems meant to save them after surviving the initial blasts.
The immediate reaction of the other surviving men, those not caught in the initial flash, was probably to instinctively plunge underwater, to escape the immediate flames and the corrosive potassium hydroxide. However, when they resurfaced moments later, the flash fire had consumed virtually all the remaining oxygen in the compartment. They would have quickly died of anoxia suffocation, basically the lack of breathable air. All 23 perished, likely within about 6 hours of the initial explosions. Tragically, long before any foreign rescue aid was even called for, let alone accepted. They'd survived the initial blasts only to succumb to the secondary chemical catastrophe, a grim testament to the cumulative failures that led to this disaster.
And Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov's final note, the one found on his body, is just this desperate, faltering testament to their last moments. It's such a profound, heartbreaking piece of history, giving us a window into their final thoughts.
It truly is. His second note, written around 3:15 p.m., 15:15, just a couple hours after the first one, shows his faltering hope, but also his incredible commitment to his men right to the end. It reads, "It's dark here to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems like there are no chances, 10-20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Here's the list of personnel. Regards to everybody, no need to despair. Kolesnikov." It serves as this heroic yet profoundly heartbreaking testament to their final desperate moments and to their commander's unwavering resolve even as his own life was clearly ebbing away. #V, a flawed and delayed rescue.
So 23 men, trapped, fighting for their lives, eventually succumbing within hours to this tragic accident with their own survival gear. But what on earth was happening on the surface? Why wasn't there a swift, coordinated rescue attempt? The answer, tragically, seems to lie in a mix of secrecy, a culture of denial, and just inaction from the Russian command. Hashtag A Russian secrecy and inaction.
This is a really critical point in the tragedy, and it speaks volumes about the institutional culture in the Russian Navy at that time. The Russian cruiser Peter the Great, which was actually the Kursk's target for the mock attack in the exercise, detected clear acoustic signals of an underwater explosion at 11:30 a.m. on August 12th, right after it happened. But Admiral Popov, the commander of the Northern Fleet, reportedly ignored the report, either dismissed it or just put it to one side, didn't act on it immediately. Then the Kursk was overdue for its 1:30 p.m. check-in. That's a standard procedure. But this, too, was initially dismissed as just a minor communication issue. Apparently, that was a fairly common occurrence in a fleet suffering from poor maintenance and unreliable equipment.
And Admiral Popov, he was an ex-submariner himself, right? He must have known deep down something terrible had likely happened. But the culture of the Russian military played a big role in his initial reaction, didn't it? What was the incentive for doing nothing?
It did, to a devastating degree. There was this deep-seated problem within the Russian military, a holdover from Soviet times, perhaps. A culture where delivering bad news up the chain of command was severely disincentivized. Could be career suicide. Reporting a major disaster, especially during a high-profile exercise meant to showcase strength, could spell the end of a career. Popov likely knew, or at least strongly suspected, something terrible had happened to the Kursk. He was experienced. However, his immediate reaction on this day is to do nothing, as one source puts it. To avoid blame, avoid the political fallout, especially for such a high-profile exercise happening early in Putin's presidency. The incentive structure prioritized protecting careers and projecting an image of strength over prompt action, and that cost precious, irretrievable time.
And the government's response then became this veil of lies, systematically misleading the public and leaving those grieving families with just agonizing false hope. That must have felt like an incredible betrayal.
The deception was deliberate, it was comprehensive, and yeah, its impact on the families waiting anxiously ashore was just devastating. Popov publicly downplayed everything. He even declared the exercise a resounding success, while the Kursk was already missing, probably lying on the seabed. Official statements claimed minor technical difficulties. They claimed communication had been established with the crew, that water and oxygen were being supplied, that everyone on board is alive. These were, as our sources state bluntly, comprehensively lied to, just systematically misleading the public and the families, leaving them in this state of agonizing false hope. It was a tragedy compounded by misinformation, eroding public trust right from the very beginning.
Which meant a critical delay in even declaring an official emergency, let alone informing President Putin, who was on vacation. How long did it actually take for the severity of the situation to be formally acknowledged?
Despite these clear indications of disaster of the missed check-in, the explosion signal as an official emergency wasn't declared until 10:30 p.m. on Saturday, August 12th. That's a full 12 hours after the sinking. And even then, President Vladimir Putin, who was on vacation down in Sochi, wasn't informed until Sunday morning, almost a full day after the accident. This delay proved absolutely critical in the unfolding events. It robbed any potential survivors, like those initially in Compartment 9, of precious, vital hours, hashtag B, failed domestic efforts.
Okay, so after these critical delays and deceptions, when Russia's own domestic rescue efforts finally did get underway, they were tragically, repeatedly just ineffective. And this is largely down to outdated equipment and a severe lack of funds, right? A direct consequence of that post-Soviet decline we keep coming back to.
Precisely. The Russian rescue fleet itself was, in many ways, a victim of Russian budget cuts from the post-Soviet era. This profoundly impacted its operational readiness. The main rescue ship they had, the Mikhail Rudnitsky, was actually a 20-year-old former lumber carrier. It lacked critical stabilizers, making it almost impossible to hold a steady position in the rough conditions of the Barents Sea. And it carried these outdated deep submergence rescue vehicles, DSRVs, the ones nicknamed priests. Their performance was severely limited by antiquated technology and, again, poor maintenance. Many rescue vessels weren't even at the required 1-hour standby readiness for emergencies like this. It reflected a broader state of disrepair and a lack of preparedness throughout the Northern Fleet. The system, the hardware, the readiness, it just wasn't prepared to handle a disaster of this magnitude.
And this unpreparedness, combined with the extreme underwater conditions, just led to this string of failed attempts to reach the Kursk, didn't it? What were some of the key obstacles they ran into?
Yeah, it was just one failure after another, each more frustrating and heartbreaking than the last. The AS-34 submersible, which they finally deployed around 5:30 p.m. on Sunday, that's nearly 30 hours after the sinking, couldn't even make proper contact. It actually collided with the Kursk's propeller due to the poor visibility and strong underwater currents. It got damaged and had to resurface. Subsequent attempts to dock with the submarine's aft escape hatch were hampered by weak, outdated batteries on the DSRVs. Apparently, these batteries cost something like $1 million each, and they didn't have spares available. Unbelievable. The Kursk itself was lying on the seabed at a heavy list, tilted maybe 30 to 60 degrees to port. That made docking incredibly difficult, almost impossible for their equipment. Visibility down there was abysmal, sometimes just a few inches, just this murky, freezing darkness. And the Russian rescue pilots, well, they reportedly lacked recent experience operating on nuclear submarines, especially under such challenging conditions. Even a reconnaissance mission by another submersible, the AS-32, was apparently a fiasco due to incorrect diving depths and poor sonar performance. Every attempt just seemed to highlight another layer of systemic failure.
And to make matters even worse, one of the crucial automatic safety features on the Kursk itself, that rescue buoy, had been deliberately disabled and never switched back on. We touched on this earlier, but what were the broader implications of that decision?
Indeed, this was a critical failure that had huge consequences. The emergency rescue buoy in compartment 7. It was designed to automatically pop to the surface in a disaster like this, trailing a wire and transmitting a distress signal. But, as we mentioned, it had been deliberately disabled during a mission in 1999. The reason? To avoid detection by U.S. ships during covert operations. A stark example of operational secrecy taking precedence over fundamental safety protocols. Tragically, it was never reactivated after that mission. So when the disaster struck, it remained silent. This prevented any automatic distress signal from being sent, further delaying that critical early warning that could potentially have saved lives, or at least initiated rescue efforts much, much sooner. It really speaks to a dangerous culture where tactical advantage was sometimes prioritized over essential safety measures, with absolutely devastating consequences. #TTC, international offers and rejection.
So Russia's own efforts are failing dramatically, the clock is ticking, and the world is starting to hear whispers of a major submarine disaster. This triggered immediate international concern, offers of help started pouring in. But Russia's initial response was just a staunch refusal, wasn't it? What drove that reluctance to accept foreign aid, even as lives were potentially hanging in the balance?
That's right. Once news of the disaster inevitably leaked out, despite the initial secrecy, offers of assistance poured in almost immediately from a multitude of countries. The US, the UK, Norway, France, Germany, Israel, Italy, Canada, Sweden, Japan, a whole list. However, Russia's initial steadfast refusal of all foreign help was driven by this complex, deeply ingrained mix of factors. There was deep-seated secrecy, especially concerning their classified nuclear submarine technology. They didn't want foreigners poking around. There was immense national pride, an unwillingness to admit they couldn't handle it themselves. And there was this persistent suspicion, a holdover from the Cold War, that foreign aid would just be a cover for spying on their advanced military tech. It reflected those old Cold War mentalities, a real reluctance to appear weak or dependent in front of traditional adversaries, even in a clear humanitarian crisis.
It's a really stark illustration of how national pride can become this tragic impediment. But surely, as the situation grew more desperate, there must have been internal pressure building to accept help, even from those seen as adversaries.
Absolutely. While the official public stance was initially rigid, behind the scenes, the pressure must have been immense. But the military command, particularly Admiral Popov, seemed very reluctant to admit the full extent of their inability to conduct the rescue themselves. Accepting foreign aid would be a direct admission of severe deficiency, a huge political blow. But it wasn't just official channels. There was this proactive move by Commodore David Russell of the British Royal Navy. Apparently, without official authorization, without even a request from Russia, he immediately started mobilizing the LR-5 rescue submersible, loading it onto a huge Antonov cargo jet for transport to Norway. He was anticipating the inevitable need for help, preparing for a mission that hadn't even been officially sanctioned yet, driven purely by the urgency of the situation and the potential to save lives.
And eventually, it took significant political pressure, including that direct phone call from President Bill Clinton to President Putin, to finally break through Russia's resistance, right? But even then, the cooperation was reluctant.
Yes, intense international media pressure, which was growing daily, combined with that direct call from President Clinton urging action, finally forced Putin's hand. He ordered his admirals to accept Western aid, but not until 5 full days after the sinking. 5 days. And even then, Russia initially only requested divers. They kept the British LR-5 submersible waiting at bay for a while longer. It was really indicative of that lingering distrust, the desire to control the narrative, control access to their classified vessel. It highlighted the tension between the desperate need for help and those deeply ingrained geopolitical anxieties. It was cooperation, eventually, but on very hesitant, very limited terms. Hashtag tag tag Tachman. The truth emerges.
Okay, so after days of delay, denial, and this hesitant political maneuvering, foreign rescuers were finally authorized to arrive on the scene, bringing with them, a sliver of hope, however slim it might have seemed by then. But even at that point, the atmosphere wasn't exactly one of straightforward cooperation, was it? Hashtag tag 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 A. Foreign rescuers arrive.
Indeed, it was still very much reluctant cooperation, marked by continued tension and obstruction. The Norman Pioneer arrived, carrying the British LR-5 rescue submersible, and the Seaway Eagle arrived with its team of highly skilled Norwegian and British saturation divers, including the experienced diver Tony Scott. Yet, Russian officials, even on site, continued to obstruct and try to dictate terms. Admiral Gennady Verich, who was head of Russian search and rescue operations there, amazingly insisted at first that the LR-5 remain miles away from the Kursk. He reportedly believed, or perhaps wanted to believe, that the crew was already dead and he just wanted to bring this to a quick close, without extensive foreign interference or, scrutiny of their classified submarine wreck.
But despite that obstruction, Tony Scott and the other divers had this critical, heartbreaking mission. First, to try and establish contact with any potential survivors. What was that initial attempt like?
Their absolute first priority was to try and establish contact. They planned to tap a prearranged code on the hull, just a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was still alive in compartment 9 and could tap back. Tony Scott described putting his head right against the freezing hull, listening intently in the crushing silence of the deep. Sadly, there was no response, just an eerie, profound silence from within the wreck. So the mission then shifted grimly from potential rescue to determination. Finding out definitively if compartment 9, where the survivors were last believed to be, was flooded or dry, this would be the final confirmation of whether life was still possible inside.
And to figure that out, if compartment 9 was flooded without risking more lives by opening the main hatch immediately, the engineers on the Seaway Eagle came up with this ingenious, though quite desperate method. The MILF test, they called it. How did that actually work, and what did it reveal?
It was a remarkably clever bit of improvisation under immense pressure and incredibly difficult conditions. The engineers devised this method to check for flooding by using a small ROV, remotely operated vehicle, to squirt milk around a small equalization valve on the outer escape hatch of compartment 9. The theory was simple physics. If the compartment below was dry, at atmospheric pressure, the immense external pressure of the ocean would suck the milk rapidly inward through the valve, indicating a pressure differential. However, when they did it, there was no detectable flow in or out. The milk just sort of drifted there. That provided pretty good evidence, as they put it, that that compartment below that hatch was flooded. It meant the internal pressure was equalized with the outside seawater pressure, meaning the compartment was already full of water. It was a grim but pretty conclusive test.
And with that, the outer hatch was opened, confirming the worst. Then, the inner hatch was also opened, and any lingering faint hopes for the men of the Kursk just vanished.
Yes, the outer hatch was opened, confirming the intermediate chamber between the hatches was indeed flooded, with virtually no hope remaining now. A special wrench actually had to be manufactured on board the Seaway Eagle because the standard tools wouldn't work on the Russian hatch design. They sent it down with the ROV to open the lower inner hatch leading into compartment 9 itself. As that inner hatch was finally pushed open by the remote vehicle, the remaining trapped gas that had accumulated at the very top of compartment 9 rushed out in a stream of bubbles. Later analysis of samples confirmed this gas was unfit for human life. Mostly nitrogen, traces of carbon dioxide, virtually no oxygen. This was the final, somber, inescapable confirmation of what had happened hours, perhaps days earlier. The truth that all 118 sailors had perished.
It sounds like, though, despite all the bureaucracy and the political delays from the Russian side, the foreign rescuers themselves were truly committed to their mission, motivated by something beyond politics.
Oh, absolutely. It was, by all accounts, a remarkable display of commitment and professionalism by the Norwegian and British rescuers who were finally allowed onto the scene. They didn't give a damn about the politics in the Ministry of Defense, as one account vividly puts it. Nor did they particularly care about the Russian admirals and their complex, sometimes obstructive, directives. Their motivation was genuinely a desire to save human life, to provide those trapped men, however faint the hope, that one last chance for survival against truly overwhelming odds. It really was a testament to international maritime solidarity in the face of tragedy, offering a stark contrast to the earlier governmental foot-dragging and secrecy.
And finally, after days of speculation, misinformation, and agonizing waiting for the families, the official announcement was made, bringing that wait to a devastating end.
Yes, on August 21st, a full 9 days after the sinking, the Russian Northern Fleet Chief of Staff, Mikhail Mudsak, publicly announced that the Kursk had been flooded and all 118 sailors were dead. The truth, finally, could not be suppressed any longer. Admiral Popov, the fleet commander, then appeared in a televised statement to the nation, offering a somber apology. "Forgive me for not bringing back your boys."
The truth was finally out, and it just unleashed this wave of public anger and grief across Russia. The government's handling of the whole crisis, particularly President Putin's initial response or lack thereof, led to significant political fallout, especially since he was just 100 days into his presidency. ###### political fallout.
The public outcry was immense, yeah, and deeply emotional. It really erupted across the nation. President Putin faced this highly anticipated, incredibly tense meeting with nearly 1,000 angry and grieving family members. This was at the Vigiovo home port on August 22nd. The atmosphere was just charged with raw emotion. You had families screaming questions directly at him and other officials. "Why have you murdered our lads? Who are you going to punish for their deaths?" It was an unprecedented public display of dissent and anguish, and significantly, it was broadcast for the world to see. It really highlighted a new era for Russia where that kind of official stonewalling wouldn't necessarily go unchallenged anymore.
And that meeting included a truly shocking incident that became this stark symbol of the old ways of dealing with dissent, didn't it? Revealing a really disturbing side of how public grief was being handled.
That's right. It was a deeply disturbing moment. During the meeting, Nadezhda Telik, the mother of one of the submariners, Lieutenant Sergei Telik, just erupted in rage, screaming at Deputy Prime Minister Ilya Klebanov, who was trying to address the crowd. And in a truly shocking move, right there in front of cameras, she was forcibly injected with a sedative by a female medic, just held down and injected. This incident, captured and reported by the burgeoning independent Russian media, became the stark symbol of those old ways of dealing with dissent. A deeply troubling lack of respect for public grief and inquiry. It really highlighted the government's struggle, perhaps, to adapt to a new era demanding more transparency, even as its old authoritarian impulses clearly resurfaced under pressure.
The government's initial delays, those contradictory stories, even Putin staying on vacation during the early days of the crisis, it all fueled this widespread outrage and a profound collapse of public trust, didn't it?
Absolutely. The media, which was no longer under the tight Soviet-era restrictions, fiercely criticized the government, especially Putin's handling of the crisis and his apparent detachment in the initial days. Putin's approval ratings, which had been high, dropped significantly. He experienced public anger in a way that probably no Russian leader had since the Tsars. The crisis exposed this deep disconnect between the leadership and the public. It created a crisis of trust that definitely lingered for years and shaped public perception of his early presidency. It was a very rude awakening for the new head of state.
Now, in the aftermath, the government offered what was described as an unprecedented compensation package to the families. But even that generosity, presumably designed to soothe public anger, was met with some suspicion.
Yes. The government offered an unprecedented package, which really reflected the immense public and political pressure they were under. It included things like new apartments for the families, a cash payment of 720,000 rubles, which was about $26,000 US back then, a very significant sum for most Russians, and free phone services and electricity. All the bed sailors were also posthumously awarded the Order of Valor. However, some widows, understandably perhaps, viewed this sudden generosity with deep suspicion. They openly wondered if the government was trying to hide something. They felt maybe such generosity was unusual, maybe it hinted at guilt or an attempt at a cover-up, that the government was trying to buy silence rather than genuinely make amends or provide full answers. #B, the official investigation, and unanswered questions.
So with the public demanding answers, an official investigation was launched. It apparently culminated in this massive report. But how much of that actually saw the light of day? And how did that affect public confidence?
Well, the official investigation, which was led by Russia's Prosecutor General Vladimir Ustinov, was exhaustive by all accounts. It culminated in a massive 133-volume top-secret report. However, only a tiny fraction of that, just a 4-page summary, was publicly released. And that wasn't until August 2002, nearly 2 full years after the sinking. This minimal transparency, predictably, only deepened public skepticism. It fueled countless conspiracy theories and left many people feeling that the full truth was still being withheld, perhaps to protect senior figures.
And that report, the summary at least, ultimately confirmed the tragic root cause, negligence related to those dangerous HTP torpedoes. Can you elaborate on the systemic failures it highlighted?
Yes, the official summary confirmed what many experts had suspected all along. The disaster began when hydrogen peroxide leaked from that faulty Type 65 practice torpedo, triggering the first explosion. The report cited widespread negligence, outdated equipment, and multiple breaches of protocol. It also specifically highlighted that the officer who approved the use of these volatile HTP torpedoes actually lacked the proper authority to do so, and that the dummy torpedo itself was a decade old, had parts exceeding their service life, was possibly damaged during transport, and that crew warnings about fuel leaks beforehand were reportedly dismissed or ignored. These were all presented as critical systemic failures that directly contributed to the catastrophe. A clear indictment, really, of a military suffering from the decay of the post-Soviet years.
But despite this official conclusion, these politically convenient conspiracy theories, like a collision with a NATO sub, persisted for years, often even propagated by some officials. How did the government's lack of transparency feed into those narratives?
Indeed. Those persistent, politically convenient conspiracy theories that the Kursk had collided with a NATO or American submarine or maybe hit an old World War II mine kept circulating for years. Some Russian officials even continued to push them. These theories offered a convenient external scapegoat, didn't they? Deflecting blame from internal failures, negligence, and outdated technology. However, there was never any credible evidence produced to support these collision theories. The damage patterns didn't match, and the seismic data pointed clearly to internal explosions. But the government's own dearth of credible information undoubtedly contributed to the many absurd conspiracy theories that flourished in that vacuum of transparency. People naturally seek answers, and when official channels don't provide them convincingly, alternative narratives take root.
And what about actual accountability? Were those deemed responsible for the negligence, the protocol breaches? Were they held criminally liable for this catastrophic loss of 118 lives?
Disturbingly, no. There was a profound lack of real criminal accountability. While about 12 senior officers, including Admiral Popov and Deputy Prime Minister Klebanov, were eventually dismissed or reprimanded for organizational flaws, note. Not directly for the disaster itself, no one was convicted or sent to prison. This reflected a deeply ingrained pattern, perhaps, in the Russian military and political system at the time, where officials often moved into other prominent positions despite past failures. For example, Admiral Popov, the fleet commander who initially delayed the response, later became a senator. It suggested a system that often protected its own, rather than holding individuals fully accountable for their actions or, significantly, their inactions. ###C, the salvage operation.
Despite the controversy, the lack of full accountability, President Putin did make this solemn pledge to raise the Kursk from the seabed and retrieve the bodies of the sailors. That must have been an enormous technological challenge, unprecedented in scale, wasn't it?
It truly was an immense undertaking, a testament perhaps to national resolve, but also driven by the immense public pressure to bring the sailors home. Putin's pledge led to this massive contract, somewhere around $65 million, awarded to two Dutch companies, Smid International and Memoe, specialists in heavy lifting and marine salvage. They were tasked with undertaking what became the largest and most complex submarine salvage operation ever attempted up to that point. It required incredibly innovative engineering, immense resources, specialized barges and equipment, and just incredibly precise execution to pull a wreck of that size and weight from those depths.
And the process of actually raising this giant ruined vessel was incredibly arduous and delicate, I imagine. What did it involve?
Oh, it was an incredibly arduous process, yeah. It began 11 months after the accident, in July 2001. First, the severely damaged forward section, the bow area, which still contained unexploded torpedoes and was considered too unstable and dangerous to lift, was carefully cut off underwater using specialized cutting wires. It was left on the seabed to mitigate the risk. Then, the main hull, the remaining 80% or so, was lifted by this massive purpose-built barge called the Giant 4. It used 26 powerful hydraulic jacks connected to immense steel cables that had been painstakingly attached to reinforced points on the Kursk's hull. On October 8, 2001, after about 15 hours of incredibly delicate, precise work, carefully balancing the immense weight, the Kursk was successfully brought to the surface. It was then towed, semi-submerged, to a dry dock at the Roslyakovo shipyard near Murmansk, a truly remarkable feat of engineering.
And then came the grim but absolutely necessary task of recovering the bodies of the sailors, bringing some measure of closure, at least, to their grieving families.
Yes, a very grim task indeed, and one that brought a renewed wave of grief as the full horror inside the wreck was revealed. The recovery of the sailors' bodies, most of which were found inside the wreck after the salvage operation, was carried out painstakingly by investigation teams. Forensics experts worked tirelessly to identify them, often under very difficult circumstances. Ultimately, all but 3 of the 118 crewmen were positively identified and the remains returned to their families for burial, bringing some measure of final, tragic closure, allowing them to finally mourn their loved ones properly. Hashtag tag DN during lessons and reforms.
Looking back now, years later, the Kursk disaster is often seen as more than just a terrible naval accident. Some historians, some analysts have suggested it was maybe the last dramatic event of the Cold War. What does that perspective tell us about the nature of that long conflict?
It's a compelling perspective, actually, one that really highlights the often unseen or perhaps forgotten human cost of the Cold War. The Kursk disaster can indeed be viewed, symbolically at least, as the last dramatic event of the Cold War, starkly reminding the world that even a conflict often perceived in the West as largely bloodless, fought through proxies and espionage, well, it had profound, deadly consequences for those on the front lines. It highlighted that 118 guys and a lot of families, as one commentator put it, could testify otherwise. They paid the ultimate price for systemic issues, for technologies, for doctrines rooted in that era of intense military competition and secrecy. It really brought home the human element to a geopolitical struggle, often discussed only in abstract, strategic terms.
And the tragedy really hammered home a profound lesson, didn't it? About the dangers of arrogance and pride, especially when it gets mixed with high technology and crucially declining resources.
Yes, what's fascinating and deeply troubling is how the tragedy underscored that lesson. How arrogance and pride can be killers when mixed with high technology. It exposed Russia's ongoing but unrealistic commitment to a level of military technology it could no longer afford to maintain safely or operate effectively. This systemic failure, born partly from a desire to project power and maintain superpower status despite diminishing means, led directly to the compromised state of both its volatile torpedo technology and, as we saw, its tragically inadequate rescue capabilities. It was a harsh, brutal lesson in the true cost of prioritizing appearances over substance, over safety, over the lives of your own personnel.
But the disaster, despite its horror, also prompted some positive changes and reforms within the Russian military, and maybe in its approach to international cooperation, though perhaps some lingering concerns suggest not all the systemic problems were entirely fixed.
That's true. There were some concrete changes. In the wake of the disaster, Russia finally removed all HTP torpedoes from service, acknowledging their inherent danger and the terrible price paid for their continued use. President Putin also demanded sweeping reforms within the military, aiming to modernize, improve readiness, and address some of the systemic issues the disaster had so brutally exposed. And there was a significant shift eventually in international cooperation. In 2011, for the first time ever, a Russian submarine actually participated in a NATO-led search and rescue drill, Exercise Bold Monik. That was a huge symbolic step towards greater transparency and cooperation in submarine rescue, something unthinkable just a decade earlier. Additionally, Russia reportedly doubled its training of deep-sea divers. However, the sinking of the K-159 in 2003, another old nuclear submarine that sank while being towed to a scrapyard, killing 9 more men, suggests that not all systemic problems within the aging fleet or perhaps the culture were fully resolved. The path to reform was clearly long and difficult.
And today, memorials stand in Russia as a poignant reminder of the sacrifice of those 118 men aboard the Kursk.
Yes, memorials were erected in Severodvinsk, the city where the submarine was built, and also in Kursk, the city after which it was proudly named. They stand honoring the fallen sailors, ensuring their memory endures, as both a cautionary tale about the dangers we've discussed and as a tribute to their service and ultimate sacrifice.
The Kursk disaster. It really is a chilling testament to that complex interplay of human error, systemic failures, national pride, and that desperate, tragic fight for survival. It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the true cost of secrecy and that delicate, often difficult balance between national security and the urgent human need for transparency and assistance, not just in military operations, but really in any high-stakes environment where lives are on the line. It leaves us to ponder, even decades later, what we truly learned from the deep, dark silence of the ocean floor, and how those lessons, learned at such a terrible cost, continue to resonate in our world today.